Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and on this particular episode, I'm going to talk about, do you fear being alone? You know, in the whole aspect of being in relationships, that's the idea that you're going to be with someone, but you oftentimes cross those valleys which have you by yourself on your own, and a lot of times those moments are very self-reflective. They give an opportunity to do that. And if you're in the transition between relationships, sometimes there's that space that happens where you might be in a guilt phase because of things that happen. And you know, any relationship when it ends, and I'm talking about, you know, you've had a breakup of some type. Anytime it ends, you know, you go through a lot of self-doubt. You begin to question yourself because obviously they're two people and there's needs that are being met, and those things tend to, whatever fell apart, it happens. And you go on this quest to try to figure out what the mistakes are. And there's a lot of information that you're probably trying to process. You could be having thoughts, recalling conversations with your ex and comments that they have made. You might be running through your head as far as comments that you may have heard from other friends who have made observations, and even some of your own feelings. You may be regretting that you took so long to get to this place. But whatever it is, it's part of the process. And underneath all of that, I think what happens is you're trying to get through this period so that you can get on with your life and possibly go on to the next relationship. Well, sometimes being in this particular space, being in the space of being reflective and contemplating what the changes are, that's a very good place to be, because it gives you an opportunity to heal. And one of the things that we tend to do when we go into relationships is we tend to just we get involved, and there isn't necessarily a whole lot of planning around it. You know, we just sort of let our instincts take over. And when we're operating in relationships, oftentimes we're just letting our instincts take over. So when these things tend to end, we oftentimes let our instincts take over, and there isn't really a plan. So the being alone part tends to be very scary. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a map, a little bit of a template, something that you can sort of hang your hat on and, you know, work through some of the steps of what happens when you're in that transition. Okay? And I'm going to be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And in this particular episode, I am talking about, do you fear being alone? Now, I am using the example of what happens when a relationship ends and you're in that transition phase. One of the things that happens is you're obviously dealing with a loss. There's a void that has to be filled. And quite often we're really desperate for change. And when the relationship ends, then immediately you start looking for another. Now, some people operate this way, and what I want to do is I want you to pump your brakes a bit and really want to talk about what this phase feels like. And I'm really into feelings, because what happens is the fear that comes up from being alone can make you feel simply desperate for something else to hang your hat on. And what we really should strive to understand is our own self, our own independence, and knowing what your needs are, so that when you go to the next relationship, because I expect that there will be one, you want to be able to talk about these things, what your needs are, so that you can get your needs met. Relationships have challenges. That's just been from the beginning of time. That should be expected. But when people can't seem to manage to make a relationship work together, then those end, and there's somebody else out there for you. But you have to know something about yourself in order to be able to make that relationship successful. And it's usually in times like this. You can learn a lot about yourself in a relationship, and you can learn a great deal about yourself when you're out of a relationship. And part of that has to do with remembering what the breakup was about. And there's a lot of information to draw from, and realize is we do have a selective memory, so we're going to remember a lot of things. And when some people are in the transition phase, they're remembering a lot of the things that really made them upset, which can really go about to do a couple things. It can help you, it can motivate you to really look at what the problems are, and it could also motivate you to be a victim. And we certainly don't want that, because that's not very helpful. But I'm talking about looking at this for information, for clues. If you were an enabler, a person who is constantly jumping in and fixing and helping people who really need to be working on their own stuff, if you were an enabler in a relationship, then that's something you need to look at. Why were you that kind of person? Because that doesn't necessarily help you. That creates a sort of dependence, and that's not necessarily the best thing for your life, because you want to create, when you're in a relationship, you want to create interdependence, and that's where you both can count on each other. It's good emotionally, it's good spiritually, it's good physically, because that's where the relationship has a symbiotic component to it, meaning you help them, they help you. When it's really stilted and it's one-sided, then you get into situations where it's going to be more of a power struggle, and that has consequences of its own down the road. But going back to the learning aspect of when you're in this void, and some people are so afraid of being on their own, being by themselves, that they jump to the next relationship. Well, what generally happens in regular old simple terms, we generally call that a rebound. And rebounds generally don't work, for the simple reason of when you don't necessarily have a good handle on why the relationship ended, you tend to wind up repeating the same old mistakes. So it's about being reflective as to where you are, what you need in life, and how you're going to get it. Where you are is you're alone. You're by yourself. You're afraid. It's probably something that you may have feared. And what happens when our fears come true is we get into panic mode. But something to rationalize is that you will survive. You will get through this. And it's an emotional place that a lot of people don't like. And I'm not suggesting that it's something to like, but you have to embrace the moment for what it is. It's for the moment is something that many people have lived through. And if you need to be reminded of that, just look at all of the articles and books and songs out there about the subject of breaking up. So it happens to all of us, so you don't have to feel like you're isolated. But being willing to be really brutally honest with yourself is key to being able to transition this. So that's part of the self-reflective thing that happens. And one of the places that you can safely be self-reflective is with a counselor, somebody who can be objective and talk about some of the things that you've experienced so that you can work through those. There are friends who oftentimes are very good listeners for you, and hopefully you've been able to develop those kinds of relationships in life, and that would be wonderful. So you can spend time with them. And when I talk about being alone, what I'm referring to specifically is the not necessarily having to have another companion, another date, another lover right away, but the having friends to comfort you through this rough spot is certainly something that you should learn to lean on. And that's where having good friends is important. You could always use the distraction for a while, and it'll take a while to get over the hurt so that you can start making good decisions. Because what happens in some of these situations is you might get into a guilt phase about why a relationship ended, and that may not be justified. You probably could feel that because if you were in a relationship where there was a lot of blaming, a lot of things like that going on, then it's probably a way that somebody might have kept power and control over you, which was using guilt. And now you kind of start doing that to yourself. You're going to have, you're going to carry that with you, and it's really going to be pounding on you, and it's going to make you want to feel like you were a bad person. And you're not a bad person. You really have to hear that from me. You are not a bad person. You are just experiencing something in life that happens. Relationships end, and we have to pick ourselves up, rebuild ourselves, and move forward. I know that having these episodes in life creates some sort of self-doubt, because if you put a lot into being in the relationship with someone and then it doesn't work, it certainly makes you question your ability to have a good, healthy relationship. And when there's that self-doubt, it probably could spread into a lot of other areas, because we obviously invest a lot of ourselves in a relationship, whether we realize it or not. We invest a lot. So when that is gone, there's a huge void to fill, and emotionally, it could leave us pretty deflated. But when the self-doubt part tends to pervade all the other things that are happening in life, it sort of leads to you feeling depressed. And that's that depression, that feeling because of that void, that connection that you've had is now been broken. That's huge. So expect that you're going to have that loss. Expect that there's going to be some depression. There's going to be a letdown. And, you really can't counteract that with a lot of drugs or a lot, don't overeat. There's lots of things that people do to compensate for depression. And you need to learn that about yourself. And if you've been in that place before, then it's certainly familiar enough, and I hope you're doing healthy things and not self-destructive things. Some people, when they have the breakup in the relationship, they think about suicide, and that's pretty extreme, but it does happen because the relationship was very important. And sometimes those very heavy, those very kinds of thoughts mean that you need to get help, and certainly avail yourself of that resource, whatever it is, your doctor. Reach out to your friends, tell them how you're feeling desperate, because they will want to be there for you. They will want to try and do what they can, but do it in a healthy way. It's, overindulging with recreational drugs or alcohol or food. These things are not necessarily going to help your situation. I consider those things Band-Aids, and eventually a Band-Aid wears out, and you're going to have to get to something better. So it's about learning better habits. Remember, this is an opportunity to be self-reflective and to put in healthier things, because maybe some of these toxic behaviors what might have been cause for the breakup in the first place. So it's an opportunity to rethink some of that. Now, one other thing that happens, figuring out what happened, that your relationship ended. Now, this can be kind of tricky because we all have our own selective memory. And sometimes in relationships, when they split, it could be amicable, and you may have the opportunity to be in communication with the ex. And they could, if the relationship is one of those where you can still be in communication and you can get some very good insight as to what the problem is, then decide for yourself if that's a safe thing for you to do. Because again, we're not trying to necessarily rekindle that relationship. We're really trying to figure out for you where the problems are so that you can improve your life. But if you're a person that's kept a journal or a diary, it might be helpful to go back and review many of your entries over, say, an expanded period of time, because there might be some information that you can mine from that could be very helpful as to helping to figure out, okay, what went wrong for you. If you're a person that tends to, and I'm just describing an example here. If you tend to be neglectful of your significant other, you spend a lot of time working on projects instead of working on the relationship, because the relationship itself does need maintenance. All of them do. You might glean that information, and that might be why the other person left, because they didn't feel safe, they didn't feel nurtured, they didn't feel loved or appreciated. Well, here's an opportunity for you to see for yourself one of a couple of things. Maybe the person was too needy for your style, so you would want to pick somebody who might be a little more independent. Or you may look at how you spent your time. Maybe you spent more time with your friends rather than your significant other. And those observations are very, very, very important, because they could be related to your value system. Meaning, if you grew up in a really close family, then being around people, your significant other family members, is really important to you. But if you did not grow up in that type of environment, then that may not be a perception that's really apparent to you. And your significant other may have been giving you that information because they may have grown up in a family, a group of people that's really close, but you didn't fit that need. So things fell apart. It could be over money. Money, children, and sex are three of the more, I don't want to say popular, but three of the large reasons why people have breakups in relationships. And if you didn't learn to communicate with your significant other in a relationship about these things, and maybe you were very, very afraid to, because for fear it was going to cause something, well, you need to learn to get past that awkwardness and bring up the conversation. Have the conversation, the talk. Because when you don't, I think most people are sort of intuitive about that. There is something going on, and it's just unspoken. And I know it takes a lot of courage to say these things, but courage is what you need. You have to find that and speak to that need. Because when you begin to talk about these things, when you begin to create the space to talk about these things, then you actually create a healthy space in the relationship to discuss things. And something that I've talked about in the past is when you're creating a safe space to have conversations, then you can get good things to happen. In conversations like this, they don't have to go on and on and on. You create a time limit so that it doesn't sound like it's just a gripe session, but we're really looking for solutions. But you create in your relationship the opportunity to be able to problem solve, and that's very important. But back to the subject of what it's like being alone and making wise choices, this is where you get an opportunity to do it different than the way you've done it before. And having a different idea about what's going to work for you, having fresh ideas, you can gather that from, again, books that you might read, having a counselor, partaking, spending time with your friends, which can not so much to talk about the relationship breakup, but to give you some fresh air, to get to do something different, which could then help introduce a new idea into your mind. Sometimes we're just so stuck in our heads that we don't do anything other than dwell on the problem, and you really need to give yourself a little bit of space from that. I'm going to take a short break, and I'll be right back to talk about, do you fear being alone?
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Well, hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I was talking about the do you fear being alone? And when you have that relationship that ends, it's sometimes we become desperate for change, and the making good decisions about that, because this here is an opportunity for you to make the change. And when I'm saying change, I'm talking about something that's really material, something that's significant for you. There's a lot of input that you're probably, your mind's probably going to be racing about wanting to fill the void, when what the opportunity is here to do is to think about where you've been, what's been happening in your life. And when you have a relationship that's been a part of your life for a while, obviously there's the loss, and there's a lot of information to be gleaned from that. But making changes, what we don't want to do is making changes that are desperate or that seem desperate, because that's not going to help you. That's going to put you right back in the place that you were, and you're going to reflect on that. And I've talked about guilt. I've talked about self-doubt. Being self-reflective, I think, is one of the most important things that have happened in this particular space. And I talked about friends, how they could give you input, how a counselor, how you could probably look at some of your diary entries, or if you journal, and all of these places you can get information. But I want you to learn to be able to be with yourself so that you can experience that without having to be under the influence of others. And because one of the things that happens in relationships is when we're in the experience of others, we have certain responsibilities, and we're being nurturing, we're being all of those, but sometimes we neglect ourselves. And when you can sort of take the time now, being reflective, to nurture yourself, that's a very important thing to realize, because your body needs you now. You need you. And learning how to take care of yourself in this area will really go a long way to actually helping your new partner to be a better partner for you, because there's a lot of information that you're going to be able to share with them. And one of the things I talk about when you're meeting somebody for the first time, asking relevant questions, and not just for the fluff of just making idle chit-chat, but really asking questions that give you information as to what kind of nurturer the other person is, what their family history is, what their experiences have been like. And not just time to dish on the X's, but to really sort of imagine, what is a life going to be like, or what is your time going to be like with a person. So, but before you can get there, you really have to be doing the homework. You have to be doing the thought process on yourself. So again, taking that a step further backwards, it's about being alone, being in your own space, learning that it is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. It could be weeks, it could be months before you're ready to be involved with someone else. And that's perfectly okay. Don't be in a rush because your speed is your speed. It's not your friends. It's not relatives. It's not their speed. It's your speed. It's your clock. It's your time. It's your life. And take all the time you need. Give yourself that gift. Sometimes we get in such a rush to fill voids that we don't even know what we're filling the void with, materially. And when we don't, then we wind up taking on something that we don't necessarily need. Because you may find out that there is so much more to you than you've ever realized. You're resilient. Remember, you're brilliant, you're resilient. And if you allow these thoughts about yourself to come to the surface so that you can begin the process of healing, then you'll understand you can let the fear of being by yourself go away, because you are learning to take care of yourself. And that's really, really, really important for you as an individual. Because as your life, as your timeline moves forward, then you don't become so needy. And imagine how being self-sufficient makes you more resilient in life. And that's much more attractive than a needy person. A needy person tends to suck all the life and all the energy out of us. And if you're that, then that's very unattractive, and people tend to want to go away. They tend to want to run away from that. So if you can imagine having been in that space before, or maybe this is you, this does represent you, that's something of a significant area to do some work on, is not being so needy, being more self-sufficient. And it'll help you have the confidence going forward that you really do bring something to the table. You really are a valuable person, because you are. You absolutely are. I know we all have fears of making mistakes, and how do we clean those things up? Well, you clean those things up by being authentic, being honest with yourself, giving apologies where they are. And sometimes you need to apologize to yourself for not handling your own business, and being more diligent about that. That's something to do. Make a contract with yourself to be better to you. That's something that you can live for, really. Okay? So I'm going to close this episode by saying, don't just let instincts take over. Develop an action plan for yourself. Remember to let yourself heal. Be self-reflective. Write things down. Write your thoughts down. Learn from your mistakes. There's therapists out there. There are probably some good friends in your life who would love to spend time with you, to distract you from a lot of the heaviness that you may have experienced lately. Keep it light for yourself. And then you can begin to take the time to delve into some of the issues of what may have gone wrong. And it's okay. We've all been alone at some point in time. Just think all of the songs, all the TV shows, all of the poetry. There's lots of stuff out there to reflect on this. So don't necessarily feel like you are alone. And if you're feeling desperate, there are people out there to help you. So I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I want to thank you for listening.